Hello and welcome to Don't Shout at the Telly with me, your host, Saliha Ali. We're delighted to have with us today on the sofa Brendan O'Neill from the online magazine Spite. And Brendan will be talking to us today about the anti-war movement. Brendan, would you like to kick us off with your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I've been an anti-imperialist all of my adult life, and I've opposed all of the Western military interventions of the past few years. But we have a very peculiar situation today, I think, where we have an anti-war movement that is, if anything, even more conservative and more backward than the pro-war movement or the interventionist lobby. And it's an anti-war movement that seems to have no political principles whatsoever. And even worse than that, it has no political independence. It's entirely reliant on the disagreements within the elite itself about the war on terror, about the war in Iraq, and about the war in Afghanistan. So it's an anti-war movement that kind of feasts on the fact that our governments can't even agree on these wars and don't know whether they're good things. So what you have as a result of that is an anti-war movement that continually puts forward utterly opportunistic arguments against war rather than principled arguments. For example, it plays on the politics of fear by arguing that if we intervene in Iraq and Afghanistan, there will be more terrorism at home, i.e. we have to stay at home in order to save ourselves rather than save anybody else, which is a really kind of nationally chauvinistic argument when you think about it, because what they're saying is, if we go over there to the third world and bomb them and blow up their homes, they'll all turn crazy and come over here and blow us up on the tube. So there's a real kind of chauvinistic streak to that argument. And the anti-war movement also taps into and exploits inter-government rivalry about conflicts rather than putting forward any kind of independent of government argument. You can see that most explicitly in the fact that the anti-war movement has focused for the past 7 or 8 years entirely on Iraq, and it never said anything about Afghanistan, pretty much. It had a couple of demonstrations, might have released a couple of press releases, but it's never focused on Afghanistan in the same way. And that's because there was huge international governmental disagreement about Iraq, which the anti-war movement felt that it could exploit. But there was more international consensus on Afghanistan, so the anti-war movement had nothing to play with. And you'll notice that over the past month, the Stop the War Coalition has now started to focus on Afghanistan entirely because it's become a point of contention amongst government officials and governments around the world. So the anti-war movement is promoting a different version of the politics of fear. It's promoting a nationally chauvinistic argument, don't intervene abroad in order to save ourselves from the savages, and it only exploits intergovernmental disagreement rather than putting forward any principled positions. So I would say if you are against war, if you're against military intervention, then one of the key things you have to do today is attack the anti-war movement, because it is not putting forward any genuine anti-imperialist argument. It's merely putting forward a different version of the arguments put forward by governments themselves.
You could also take the kind of nationalistic, sort of chauvinistic argument of the anti-war lobby. You could sort of criticise them further by pointing out the fact that a lot of coverage at the moment seems to be around the safety of British soldiers in Afghanistan, and the fact that more and more of them seem to be dying, coming home in coffins, and this national outwelling of grief. And it kind of ties into this security argument as well, because British soldiers aren't seen as, professional soldiers they might once have been, whose job it is to put their lives on the line to fight, do the state's bidding, if you like. But they're just kind of citizens who are in the line of fire, and we should think about their safety as well by bringing them home. So I think it's a weird kind of cautiousness that surrounds the anti-war argument. It's about we should look after British subjects rather than think about what we actually stand for in the world.
Yeah, I think the anti-war movement has this really skewed emphasis, which is precisely on protecting Britons, whether it's British citizens or British soldiers. And it's also, what it effectively is doing is promoting defeatism. It's recognised that there is a defeatist attitude towards Afghanistan. People are weary of it, that they think it's weighing down on Britain, it's killing our boys. And the anti-war movement is just tapping into that and feasting on it and effectively promoting a culture of defeatism, promoting the message, we can never win, the goals will never be realised, so we might as well just come home. That's explicitly what anti-war representatives say now. This is an unwinnable war. And so, by logic, if they thought it was a winnable war, then they would allow Britain to stay in Afghanistan. So that culture of defeatism that the anti-war movement is pushing to the forefront is really problematic, because defeatism is the opposite of anti-imperialism. A genuine, meaningful anti-intervention politics would not be defeatist. It would be about solidarity. It would be putting forward a positive message about the capability of other people to run their own affairs. It would be defending democracy, defending sovereignty, but all we get from the anti-war movement is a promotion of defeatism. We can't win, we're all going to die, let's stay at home and never venture outside our front doors.
One of the things that seems fairly apparent, for instance, with David Cameron's recent intervention into the discussion on Afghanistan, and you heard quite a lot of it to do with Iraq as well, it's not so much about not going to war, but how you can go to war better. So there was all the talk about getting resolutions from the UN as if a kind of magic piece of paper will make that war all right. Like, oh, we didn't plan enough for the occupation. So if they'd planned it properly and had occupied Iraq far more thoroughly with more troops and more brutally, then would that be okay then?
Yeah, what's really interesting about the anti-war movement today is that it's effectively become a bargaining chip between the great Western powers. That's the role it's now playing. And you can see that in the way in which the anti-war movement and the peace movement now promotes the UN as the sensible voice of international reason over the US, which is seen as being a bit more irrational, certainly under President Bush. And so the peace movement now continually says we have to listen to the UN. It focuses on the fact that the war in Iraq was ostensibly illegal because the UN didn't okay it. The flip side of that being that if the UN had okayed it, then it would have been legal and acceptable. And this actually means that the anti-war movement is becoming like the peace movement was in the late 19th century and for parts of the 20th century, which is that it's helping Western powers to rehabilitate their international image and the interventionist role that they play. The peace movement, if you look at it historically, it's always played that role where it presents itself as being radical and pro-peace and, you know, caring about people around the world, but it's always played a kind of subtle role in reorganising international affairs and allowing Britain and America and France and other powerful nations to represent their interventionist ideals in a positive way. So the peace movement was key in the setting up of the League of Nations, for example. The peace movement played a key role also in the setting up of the United Nations, you know, these kind of two huge organisations which were really about representing and repackaging Western domination of the globe. And now the anti-war movement has made itself a key promoter of the UN, particularly in opposition to America and in opposition to Israel. It's rehabilitating the image of the UN as the lawgiver, the legitimate body that should say when war is legitimate, the ruler of the world, effectively. And all that is doing is giving Western intervention a new gloss and allowing Western governments to rethink how they present things. So it's the opposite of radical. It's a really problematic thing which ought to be challenged, I think.
I think it plays its role as possibly the court jester in the international arena, where you don't take it too seriously, but at the same time you do, because it helps to legitimize your cause when it comes to actually selling your idea to an international body such as the UN. And I think that's a very slippery slope that we're going down, because it sort of has no end.
Yeah, I think you can see a really good example of that in relation to Darfur, because a lot of the peace activists on Iraq, they said, don't go to Iraq, Bush is evil, he's going to destroy Iraq. They said, instead, we should be focusing our energies on going into Darfur. So they just presented an alternative war, one that they thought was justified. And, you have people like George Clooney, Mia Farrow, all these kind of Hollywood celebrities who were dead set against the war in Iraq, but said that instead we should send military men and helicopters and firepower to Darfur. And the impact of that peace activism was disastrous, because what it did, it really heightened the conflict in that region of Sudan. It really gave the Darfur rebels a sense that they should carry on fighting. We've got powerful Western interests behind us, let's keep going, let's keep going. It also inflamed other Sudanese rebel groups to have a go at Khartoum, the capital, because they also thought Khartoum is now so unpopular and so demonised in the West that we should take our opportunity to weaken it even further and push it from power. So the role of that peace activism was actually to create conflict and to create war and to create bloodshed. And I think that's an example of where the international role of the peace lobby in kind of re-legitimising Western intervention can be seen most clearly.
Do you think that anti-war movements are a product of conflict, or are they more a product of something more basic, or something completely separate from conflicts, specific conflicts themselves?
I think the anti-war movement and the peace movement has definitely changed over time, and it's gone through different historical periods, and it's appeared differently in each one. In the 19th century, it was largely Quakers who were anti-war, and they were very pacifist. They just didn't like war itself. They were just quite pacifist people. In the early 20th century, there were lots of socialist radical movements that were opposed to the First World War, and then opposed to fascism and opposed to other forms of military violence. But they weren't pacifists. They supported wars of resistance, for example. They supported the use of violence. That was a much more radical opposition to war, I think. And then you have the anti-war movement around Vietnam, which is one of the most famous ones. And I think it's worth comparing the Vietnam anti-war movement to the anti-war movement we have today, because that really shows you how much the anti-war movement has kind of slid down and become this kind of really pretty horrible thing. Because the anti-war movement in relation to Vietnam was about lots more things than simply Vietnam. It was bound up with the movement for civil rights in America, with the movement for women's equality, with the idea that society in the West should be organised differently. Today, the anti-war movement doesn't have any positive kernel to it at all. It's entirely negative. It's not part of any broader political programme. It's not part of any more radical vision. It's just a kind of really despondent, shoulder-shrugging, leave us alone kind of negative attitude. So if the Vietnam anti-war movement was really captured disenchantment with the Western way of life and the idea that things should be done differently, I think the anti-war movement today just captures despondency. And the difference in slogans, the Vietnam slogan was "Hell no, we won't go," which was a kind of positive statement that we will not go to Vietnam and shoot these foreign people. And the anti-war slogan today is "Not in my name," leave us alone, we want to stay at home, we don't want to risk anything, we don't want to take any chances. So I think the anti-war movement today expresses negativity, cynicism, despondency, a lack of vision, a lack of faith. And if you just contrast that to earlier anti-war movements, you can see how much it's degenerated.
Do you think that's due down to the lack of a sense of immediacy, a sense of crisis in our comfy, Western lifestyles, where we're just grown so comfortable with the status quo that we just don't challenge anything anymore? We're just very lazy people.
I don't think it's related to comfort. I don't think material comfort necessarily makes people lazy or politically cynical. I mean, the people who led the anti-war movement around the Vietnam period were the wealthiest people in America. They were the middle classes. They were the people who were at university. They were being well educated. They were the people who were set to take over American institutions and to rule public life. They had very comfortable lives, but they still felt that things should be done differently. They still felt radicalised. So I don't think it's to do with material wealth. I think it's just a changed political and cultural atmosphere where people are now less likely to believe that big change is achievable, or that it's worth taking risks, or that it's useful to have a different vision of society. All those things impact on how people react to war today. And the way they react to it is just by throwing their hands in the air and saying it's all horrible, it's all a mess, too much bloodshed, and this kind of weepy, self-pitying, self-protecting instinct.
Brendan, you mentioned as a criticism of the anti-war movement this idea of self-preservation, and I was just interested how everyone feels really about why that should be a criticism. I understand, like the Vietnam War, we're not fighting it, on our territory, but I would like to know whether people genuinely believe that there is a risk if we don't get Pakistan and Afghanistan under control to our own, to events that will happen in this country, and therefore whether it is a valid criticism.
Well, and further to that point, my question was going to be whether if we did do a weepy, soppy, let's save ourselves campaign and it stopped a war, is that then a valid campaign, or would we still oppose it on the fact that it doesn't have any principled arguments? And also whether you feel that there is a point at which we should intervene, say North Korea or Zimbabwe, where people aren't being given the democracy which you hold so dear. Is there a point at which it becomes right for the Western imperialist powers to intervene? Or indeed, is there a point of attack against other large powers who aren't Western, like China in Tibet?
You were saying that the anti-war movement now has become a very negative thing, and that all the rhetoric around it, the "not in my name," is, wholly negative compared to the Vietnam War. However, and that there's this sense of despondency, and I know a lot of people who protested and, got up and were against George Bush and, protesting against the Iraq War. And then because the government, and then afterwards felt a great disillusionment because nothing actually happened despite this great, everyone getting together, rousing, public show of disagreement. And then the government appeared to kind of ignore that and carry on with what they were doing anyway. And are people therefore not being disillusioned by the fact that, it's not going to happen, it doesn't matter, we don't actually have a voice anyway. So, perhaps that's to do with why, there wasn't as much of a show about Afghanistan and everything else.
I think that disillusionment actually existed before the protest. There was a general kind of, people were getting a bit bored of Blair. He'd been in power for 6 years in 2003, and they felt that the government wasn't doing what they thought it should do. And so that disillusionment you're talking about actually preceded the anti-war protest in February 2003.
So that it was exacerbated afterwards?
Well, I think actually, if I was on the anti-war protest for hours and hours, I talked to far too many people, and that was the sentiment of the anti-war protest. It was very much a kind of, we're bored of Blair, we're tired of New Labour, they don't listen to us, they don't ever give us what we want. And Iraq was just the means through which people were expressing that broader sense of disillusionment. That was the problem with that protest. It wasn't a kind of independent, principally minded anti-war protest in defence of Iraqi sovereignty or anything. It was a kind of very much anti-Blair, knee-jerk outpouring. And then it was exacerbated by the fact that no one listened because people were already thinking that. On the question of whether it's our responsibility to get Afghanistan and Pakistan under control, and should we intervene in places like Zimbabwe, well, the key thing is we are intervening in Zimbabwe already, and it was precisely because we intervened in Afghanistan and Pakistan that those problems exist now. Britain spent many years ruling Zimbabwe and kind of warping its economy and its political structure. And it continues to intervene in Zimbabwe today through economic sanctions, through restricting the travel rights of Zimbabwe's rulers, through refusing to allow Zimbabwe to sell certain things on the international market, through restricting the imports of medicines and foods and weapons and so on. So Western intervention is very much alive and well in Zimbabwe, and there are some of us, including me, who would argue that lots of the troubles in Zimbabwe in recent years have been exacerbated precisely by that Western demonisation of Mugabe. And then in relation to Pakistan and Afghanistan, there are numerous local conflicts there. There's no question between the Taliban and various other political groups. And, some people say it's on the cusp of civil war and all that kind of thing. But the key thing to bear in mind is that terrorism in the West doesn't come from that part of the world, fundamentally. The people who executed the 9/11 attacks were, for the most part, Saudis. There were a few Egyptians. There was not one single Afghan person involved in the execution of 9/11. The guys who carried out the 7/7 bombings in London were all from Leeds or different parts of Britain. They may have been of Pakistani descent, but they were brought up in this country. The terrorism that is a problem, is a genuine problem in the West, is a product of Western societies and a sense of Western decadence, and the inability of Western societies in particular to include every group in society itself, or to enthuse people with a vision of the future. All those things impact on people's relationships with society and push certain people into radical Islam or other ideas that they think are more coherent. So that terrorism is a Western phenomenon, I would argue, and to go to Afghanistan and Pakistan to try and find a solution to it is really just a huge displacement activity. It will just make the conflicts in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the local conflicts, worse, and it won't address the problem of Western-born terrorism that we do face today.
You've sort of damned each war that we've had for certainly also the last 30 years or so, going, I assume you also against Vietnam. When was the last just war, and what was the criteria for that?
I think it's worth pointing out at this juncture that I am not anti-war. I'm not a pacifist. I hate pacifists, they get on my nerves. I would describe myself as an anti-imperialist, but even that doesn't really work today because there's no such thing as imperialism in any meaningful way. So it's hard to know what to describe myself as, but I'm not anti-war. I guess I'm anti-intervention, anti-Western intervention. But, there are sometimes when violence is justifiable and when it's the only response people really can take up. So I would argue, for example, that the Irish Republican Army's war against British occupation of Northern Ireland was justifiable. They didn't start the war, but they took up some means to try to end it. And, you know, instances like that, when groups of people feel that they have no choice but to launch a war or to launch a counter conflict against an occupying army or an oppressive power, those conflicts are justified, I think. And I'm not going to complain about the violence that those groups use.
What about wars between states? Because, I mean, obviously it's easy to support a liberation struggle by a group of people, but all the wars we've spoken about other than that have been wars about a state going in and taking action against another state or against a group of people in a country. Is there ever a war that's justified when a state goes to war?
Well, I can't think of one in recent times. And, you know, something like the Vietnam War, it's worth remembering that that was also an internal war, as well as being a war of imperialism launched by America. It was a war between South Vietnam, the Stooge government, which was supported and backed by America, and North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, who wanted to liberate Vietnam from American influence and from the kind of, you know, Stooge government of the South. So that war was more complicated than simply the American state invading another state. There was also a conflict within that state, one side of which was worth supporting, I think, and the other side of which was not. But if any of you can name a war in recent times where you think it has been justifiable for one state to launch a war against another state, then I'd be interested to talk about it.
What about the first Gulf War in relation to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait?
Well, the first Gulf War wasn't really about Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Whatever propaganda you may have been reading or whatever propaganda you may have heard, the first Gulf War was, you know, as you will recall, it took place in 1991, shortly after the end of the Cold War, shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was about the West reasserting itself in a new global era, which is why pretty much every powerful Western state backed that war, led by America, supported by Britain, supported by France, supported by Italy. There were around 30 nations who backed the conflict against Iraq, which was this falling apart, collapsing, pathetic country, just come out of the Iraq-Iran war, was in poverty, was not a threat to anybody. And the invasion of Kuwait was used as an excuse to justify an extraordinary display of Western power against a weak state in the Third World. And it's not the first time that Western governments have used the invasion of a smaller country to justify an imperialist war. I mean, you know, the First World War, for example, was justified in the name of defending Belgium, but in fact it was about Western imperialist powers fighting over territory and power and influence. The Second World War is remembered by most people now as an attempt to defend poor little Poland. But, you know, the Allies involved in that war didn't really care very much about Poland. It was about reasserting their authority against the threat of Germany. So it's not the first Gulf War was not the first time that Western governments cynically said that they were out to defend some poor little country, which, by the way, was not even a democratic state and was not any kind of state that I would want to defend.
I think in terms of comparing not so much the wars but the anti-war movement, I do agree that the Vietnam protests were successful, but it did take 20 years. And I personally, I'm an optimist, and I don't believe that we've got the stomach for 20 years in Afghanistan, and that's partly because of you know, the media bringing the images home to the point of saturation. You know, for the first time that happened in Vietnam, and that's largely attributed to the success of the protests. So, you know, I tend to be more optimistic, and I just wonder why you take a dimmer view of these anti-war protests.
Well, I think one important thing to bear in mind about the anti-war protests in relation to Vietnam is that I think they were definitely more positive than what we have today, but the anti-war movement didn't bring the Vietnam War to an end. It had an impact, it had a great influence, but that war was brought to an end by two more important things, which was firstly the strength of the liberation movement in Vietnam, which was gaining in strength and gaining in numbers. And in 1968, for example, it launched the Tet Offensive, which was this massive attack on South Vietnamese and American forces, which really kind of devastated the American-led intervention there. And also, the second important thing was disillusionment within the military brass itself about the war being winnable, and their realization that this just couldn't be won, that they were going to be defeated, and that they needed to find a way out as soon as possible.
Sounds like Afghanistan.
Well, yeah, well, those two things I think were more important than the anti-war movement, but then the anti-war movement is key because it kind of pushes things in a certain direction and kind of brings to a head all those various different things. So the anti-war movement in relation to Vietnam wasn't entirely 100% positive and brilliant and wonderful. It also did have a slightly defeatist tone to it. You know, we don't want any more people brought home in body bags. You know, it focused a lot on the suffering of American soldiers who did suffer greatly. 50,000 of them died, rather than focusing on the suffering of Vietnamese people who suffered far more greatly. 2 million of them died in a country of 18 million. But having said that, there were more positive elements to it, such as having a broader vision, tying it in with wanting to change American society, with wanting to change the position of black people and change the position of women. So it was more positive. But even that anti-war movement was not the sole reason for ending that war. So I think the idea that a less positive, more degenerate, more self-protective, narcissistic anti-war movement which we have today will be able to prevent wars in Afghanistan, Iraq and Darfur and anywhere else is really not going to happen.
Why should we reject the anti-war movement just because it's feeling negative? Just because people are feeling that their action is ineffective, isn't that more reason to support them even more?
No, because I think the anti-war movement has now, not only is it not effective, and it's not really putting forward the right arguments and it's not putting forward the right spin and so on, it's now become counterproductive. That's the problem. And I've been struggling with this question of whether, you know, the Iraq War in 2003, I was completely against the Iraq War, and it was a disaster, an unmitigated disaster. But I think if the Western powers hadn't, I think Rodri raised this question earlier, if the Western powers hadn't gone to war in Iraq on the basis of the anti-war movement's arguments, which were kind of, let's stay at home, let's not do anything, let's not take any risks, let's just protect ourselves from those crazy people over there, would that have been better? Would it have been better for the war not to have taken place on the basis of entirely anti-human, misanthropic, nationalistic arguments than for the war to have taken place? And I don't think that's easily answerable, really, because I think there is an argument to be made that if it had not taken place on that basis, then historically that could have been a worse thing for, you know, for political progressives, for people who want to change society. That could have been more problematic. But I'm open for disagreement on that, because obviously the consequences of the war going ahead anyway were pretty disastrous and continue to be pretty disastrous.
Do you not think partly, though, the reason it's been chopping and changing its argument could be because the government haven't been completely transparent with everything that's going on? The media is completely spinning things that, you know, shouldn't be the focal points.
I think in terms of the question about the transparency of the government and the fact that the arguments for the war itself continually changed and weren't honest, and we all know that's true now. I think if anyone in this room can name to me one Western intervention of the past 100 years that hasn't been built on lies and misinformation, I'll give you £50. There's none. You know, every war that's ever taken place in recent history has been based on misinformation, propaganda, exaggeration. You know, to come back to Rodri's example of the first Gulf War, you know, we all remember that there was the story about Iraqi soldiers taking babies from incubators in Kuwait and leaving them to die on the floor so that they could use the electricity and the power and all that kind of stuff. Just completely false, completely invented by a PR company, complete lie. And that was one of the key justifications for the war in Western media and in Western propaganda. The Kosovo War of 1999 was justified in terms of that 100,000 people could have been killed by the Serbs, that the Kosovo Albanians were suffering a genocide at the hands of the Serbs. Just was completely untrue. And the end result for the conflict in Kosovo in 1999 is about 3,000 people died, including 600 people killed by NATO in their intervention. So every war is built on misinformation, but the key thing for the anti-war movement is to expose that. Of course, that's a key part of it, but also to approach that with a kind of principled stance and a principled argument.
As an anti-war person myself, I kind of subscribe to the very simple view that, you know, give peace a chance, war is bad, war kills people. And rather than asking for the anti-war movement to respond in equally complex and sophisticated ways, what's wrong with the argument simply that war is bad and war kills people?
Well, firstly, war is not always bad. As I was saying earlier, there are some wars that are justifiable, wars of resistance, when people fight for more independence in their lives or for freedom or for justice. They couldn't be described as bad wars because they're wars for a good purpose. Also, I think it's worth bearing in mind it's not only war that kills, peace can kill as well. You know, I'm with PJ O'Rourke on this, who wrote a book called Peace Kills. He did it from a mad right-wing American perspective, but there's an element of truth in that, which is that lots of the kind of things that are promoted under the guise of peace today, like peace processes in Africa and the Middle East and Ireland and various other places, have led to more conflict and more death and more division. So I think it's a slightly naive, if you don't mind me saying so, to just say war is bad and peace is good in the way that John Lennon and Yoko Ono did in 1969 and, you know, bored everyone rigid with their bed-ins and all that kind of stuff. It's more complicated than that, because war is sometimes good and peace is sometimes bad. So I think that's why it's important to have proper analysis of what lies behind conflicts and divisions and tensions, and a proper principled approach to them, because on some occasions, for example, the American and Brussels-led peace process in the Middle East, I would be opposed to what is called peace, because it's created partition in the Middle East, it's divided Israelis and Palestinians even more, it's led to further tensions and further conflict. And there are other times when wars are described as bad, for example, the use of violence by groups of people who want to liberate themselves or fight for democracy, when I would say actually it was good. So peace and war can be very deceptive phrases, and that's precisely why we need to have a more kind of slightly grown-up anti-John Lennon approach to these issues.
Sometimes not going to war could be worse than going to war, but you know, even going to war, there's some real consequences for those people, like in Iraq. I mean, you know, it's not that great for them. So wouldn't you, why should we sort of, in order to not support the anti-war movement, then, you know, sort of say it might have been better to go to war? Why can't we just oppose both of them, both the state and the anti-war movement?
Well, I do oppose both of them. I was kind of throwing it out there as a question, really, to see what other people think, because I'm genuinely uncertain about whether it would have been better not to invade Iraq on the basis of the pretty misanthropic arguments that were made against it, or whether it was better that the war at least went ahead, which showed some element of subjectivity amongst our rulers, for want of a better way of putting it. So that is, I'm genuinely torn on that. What I'm saying is that I think the anti-war arguments in relation to Iraq were in some ways more conservative and less supportive than the pro-war arguments. That's what I'm saying. So, but I'm sure people disagree with that. I would be surprised if people didn't disagree with that.
But we can just sort of disagree with both of them at the same time, right?
Yeah, but I don't think you can just abolish the anti-war movement, because it's a free movement. You know, it's kind of, it's a fairly grassroots movement. I mean, who would abolish it? It'd have to be abolished by the state or something, which I would be opposed to. However, I think I probably am in favour of abolishing the United Nations, because I think that is one of the most problematic institutions today, and I think people have a lot of misperceptions about it. And I'm also in favour of abolishing the idea of human rights, because I think they are actually anti-rights and anti-liberty often. But I would like to know what other people think about that, because whenever I tell someone that probably it would be a good idea to get rid of the UN, they look at me as if I'm slightly demented.
Because the principal aim of the UN is peace, and that's you know, officially that is its chief function, is to promote peace throughout the world. That's its stated aim. Would you also want to abolish NATO, because that's a military solution?
Yeah, I would definitely support the abolition of NATO, but I think you have a slight misunderstanding of the role of the UN, which you say its role is to promote peace, but in fact the role of the UN is to legitimate a form of Western domination of the world. If you read about the origins of the UN in the 1940s, particularly you should read Gabrielle Kolko, an American author who wrote a brilliant book on how the UN was founded. And it was founded explicitly as a way of codifying American power after the Second World War. There was a recognition amongst American leaders that the war was going to change everything, parts of Europe would be defeated, Japan would be defeated, so how could we codify America's domination of the world in a way that sounded more PC, which emphasised peace rather than war, which emphasised respect for sovereignty rather than explicit Western colonialism. All those discussions were had very openly amongst American officials in particular. There was lots of blackmail of smaller nations, there was lots of coercion of smaller nations to get them to support the United Nations, lots of threats and promises and so on. And for about 40 years, that is the role the UN played. It was a way of codifying Western power, which is why the 5 members of the UN Security Council are all the victors of the Second World War. Britain, France, America, China and Russia. And those who lost in the war, particularly Germany and Japan, were not allowed on. It was an expression of that. And it worked for about 40 years. The reason the UN is kind of divided now, and the reason the UN is kind of often takes a stance against America, reflects the changes that have taken place since the end of the Cold War.
Isn't the problem with these supranational organisations that they are under-evolved, that they're actually in the very early stages of their development?
Well, they've had 60 years and it's still dominated by the same 5 powers, and so not much has changed.
But governments have taken hundreds of years to develop, and how much longer will it take for a supranational body to develop? Because they're obviously 60 years is probably not a very long time for something as complex as a supranational peacekeeping organisation to develop.
We can't keep saying maybe we can just sort of reform it and you know, the ideals are good and let's just reform the UN and the Security Council and all that kind of stuff, because it's wrong to begin with.
So what are you suggesting in place of it? Anything?
Abolish it.
Just have nothing?
No UN, no human rights.
But I mean, that's a ludicrous thing to say, though, isn't it? Because
I don't think so.
Well, obviously. But if we're going to say, Brendan's probably right in the idea that for the first 40 years the UN was very pro-America and set up perhaps for the wrong reasons. But as we've seen, it's begun, if anything, to slow down Western interventions in some cases. And even if it's using the ribbons of bureaucracy, which I despise, if it's slowing down interventions, which I presume this is a different view of mine anyway, but if we're completely against all interventions, if we've got something that can slow them down to give our better, more principled, because we're dishing this anti-war movement, but the better, more principled anti-war movement's more time to get going, then surely that's a good thing. And the fact that, once again, the means justifying the ends, you know, coming back to the idea that the war, if we'd stopped the war by having a really, really narcissistic, self-inward looking, we don't want to die, and what happens if they come over here? But if that's got a good result, even though it had a very poor way of getting it, surely this is always better than having a bad result, but a great way of getting there.
I think Iraq basically shows that governments and institutions that rule, which are set up overnight, are very weak and very vulnerable. And the government that was set up in Iraq has by no means taken roots and has proved itself to be like a valid democracy. And shouldn't we regard the UN in exactly the same way as the Iraqi government? It's something it's in its very early stages of development, and it just needs more time to take root.
I'm not sure. Half a century is quite a long time for something to develop, and it's also I think you're kind of mixing up what the two things are. Basically, the UN is a way of the different great powers mediating their conflicts with each other, and also the thing is the Iraqi government we have at the moment is externally imposed. Of course, it has no roots in the society because it never had any roots in the society. It hasn't emerged out of Iraqi society.
This question on how long it might take the UN to get good, I still haven't figured out what you intend the UN to be good at. We've established that they're not very good at promoting peace. We've established that they're not very good. I mean, the one thing we can say about them is they managed to, as Roger said, slow down interventions. Well, that's not worth waiting for.
I disagree. They haven't slowed down interventions.
They've legitimised interventions.
That interventions can take. I could do a list, just a few off the top of my head. I'm sure Brendan could add a lot more. Like East Timor was intervened in under UN auspices. Congo, Rwanda, Somalia,
Korea.
Korea. In the last.
There is a sense in which
it happened anyway.
No, yeah, but the UN, Rodri, is a euphemism for more interventions. It hasn't.
No, it isn't.
No, it absolutely is.
No, because
the British government.
Just because it's under the banner of peace, we can't just say
Well,
it slowed down intervention.
just because you're saying that interventions have happened under its auspices, you can't say that without the UN there would have been peace and happiness across the world.
You were using earlier the example of North Korea as a state where you don't think we can possibly get to democracy. North Korea only exists because of the actions that the UN legitimated in Korea and legitimating American action, and it's still seen as a legitimate action around the world because the UN backed it.
I'll give another example. I think the example of East Timor is quite relevant, because if the Australian government, basically Australia intervened in the neighbour Indonesia, took East Timor and now runs it, basically it's under UN auspices, so it looks like the UN has come and intervened. If the Australian government had to get up and say, yeah, we're annexing East Timor, that would have been a completely different deal for them to argue about internationally, internally. Whereas under UN auspices, we can wear our nice blue berets, we look very nice, and it's okay all of a sudden. It's a cloak people can wear, saying I'm taking the objective path of righteousness, as opposed to the dirty business of kind of national interest, which is what all of these conflicts actually are about. And the UN is just it's a smokescreen. It's a thing that gets in the way of people actually talking about politics and international relations in its own terms.
I think some of Rodri's arguments captures the problem to bring it back to the anti-war movement, which is that people now presume that there's just two choices. There's either state action or there's UN justified action, and there's no sense that there's a different way of doing things. And that's why the anti-war movement has quite explicitly played the UN card against America and Britain in particular, because it has no sense of its own agency or of its own ability to change things or of its own independence. So because of that, it's entirely reliant on the UN in so many ways. So for example, it continually bangs on about the boring fact that the war in Iraq was illegal, which for me is the least interesting fact of all. And in fact, if the war in Iraq had been legal, I think it would have been worse, because it would have involved needing more powers signed up against Iraq. It would have meant having the whole UN Security Council opposed to Iraq. It would have meant even more firepower raining down on that country.
I think we have to be very careful, though, not to put words in other people's mouths. And, living in a privileged place that we do, I'm just thinking of V.S. Naipaul, who was born in Trinidad, and he said that never forget the UN, it's the last best hope for the little countries. And I believe that a lot of these countries that we're speaking for, there is popular support for the UN, and that they've genuinely done good things, and that, when you're faced with a terrible situation and it's state sanctioned, the UN is a wonderful alternative to that.
I think there's an element of truth in what Jessica's saying, which is that certainly in the early days of what the UN offered people, third world nations in particular, was the promise of equality, because what it stood for ostensibly was that all nations would be equal. There would be sovereign equality before all nations. So lots of the anti-colonial struggles of the 1950s or 60s, it was seen as a great result to then be a member of the United Nations, because then you were an independent, sovereign, respected nation. But I think people have realised that that's only a promise, and it's not a real form of equality. And when Ghana, for example, joins the United Nations, it's not equal to America. It doesn't have the same power. It doesn't have the same decision-making power. It doesn't have the same ability to determine its own affairs or anyone else's, for that matter. So I think certainly in the early days there was a sense amongst liberation struggles and third world peoples that the UN was a good thing, because that's how they would get to the table and be the same as all their oppressors, who previously thought themselves as superior. But I think people have become disillusioned with that, and I think lots of people have realised that the UN is actually a force for destruction and coercion and occupation. The UN has led many so-called peacekeeping operations which have turned out to be very violent. The fact that people are reliant on the UN is not necessarily a good thing. It just means that they haven't their nations haven't developed sufficiently enough for them to be able to survive in any independent way.
But we have to be reliant on the government, right? And a lot of the things that they have to say are also promises which haven't been carried out. So what do you suggest we do?
Promises in what kind of sense? Just
like if a party is being elected, they make all these promises about what they want to do, what they want to change, and a lot of the time they don't actually follow through with them. So it's similar to the UN. So you're criticising the government as well.
Well, the difference between governments and UN is that you can get rid of your government, and if they don't follow through on their promises, you can vote them out, you can challenge them, you can stand against them. But when the UN intervenes in another country, there's very few democratic mechanisms for removing them or getting them out, as we saw in Somalia and other places where people experience the UN as a very oppressive presence, as the use an organisation which used force, which used coercion, and in Somalia is one instance where people actually fought against it or took up arms against it because there wasn't the same mechanisms. The UN is not a democratic organisation. It's not experienced as a democratic organisation by the people whose country it intervenes in.
But working from first principles, if the UN has authorised an intervention, which I am by no means supporting, that means that a certain number of countries must have supported that intervention. And so if we were to take your line and Sal's line of abolishing the UN, we would still have that number of countries who wouldn't have stood against an intervention. So how does that, and what's more, the countries like Ghana versus America, the inequality is still going to be there even though we've got rid of the UN. So how is getting rid of the UN going to be any help whatsoever?
Because then we might recognise what national sovereignty really ought to mean, which is that it comes from the people. That, if 100 countries said we should invade Iraq, that would not be democratic, even if it was, 3 billion, the representatives of 3 billion people, because sovereignty is something that comes from the people that live within a defined territory, or it ought to. And so any kind of intervention into that territory is anti-democratic and is anti-sovereignty. So I don't think you can have this nonsense idea of international democracy where just because a certain number of powers say it's good to invade a country, then that makes it legitimate. It doesn't. And so that's why I would argue that a legal war, which is what the anti-war movement is implicitly arguing for, because it continually focuses on the fact that the war in Iraq was illegal. So the flip side of that is, well, if it was legal, it would have been better. A legal war is worse because it just means rounding up more international powers, more arguments against a certain nation, and then the end result will be the same, which is the destruction of people's democratic rights and their right to self-determination.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to go back to the point you made earlier about challenging the government. I mean, how do we actually go about challenging the government? Because, all these wars happening in Iraq and, people don't actually agree with, there are a lot of people who are against it. And, they do go about protesting, but the government, they use their force, armies to push them against, saying like, you either agree with us, you're either with us, and, you agree with the decisions we make, or we push you out. I mean, we are the people that voted for them and then got them to the power so that, they can run the country in a safe way without going to wars and stuff. But, they're not actually wanting to hear our opinions, yet we are the people that put them there. What do you say about that?
I think, firstly, I think that kind of captures the victim mentality of people who are anti-war these days. They have this I'm not saying you, but they do have this slightly irritating victim approach. The government never listens, we march and march and march and they don't do anything. It becomes this really grating excuse for why they haven't been able to change anything. And I think the main reason is that they haven't had a consistent and principled approach to Western intervention. So I think one reason that Tony Blair thought he could get away with invading Iraq in 2003 is not just because he was arrogant and he wanted to ignore everyone and he didn't care what all those people in Hyde Park thought. It's also because in 1999, 4 years earlier, he invaded Kosovo and no one said anything. I went on 2 anti-war demos in 1999. They were both tiny. People were walking past shouting at us saying, "You're all lunatics." There was no, and because of that lack of consistency, because people didn't question and criticise the myth and misinformation he put forward in 1999, the idea that Britain had a role as a kind of moral crusader around the world, the idea that Blair was this kind of new ethical imperialist, because that was unchallenged in 1999 by the vast majority of the media and by a huge number of radical left-wing people, then Blair thought he could get away with the same thing again in 2003. So that is evidence, I think, of the need for consistency and for continually having a critical approach every time our governments put forward Western intervention. And if we were more consistent and more principled and kind of had some political independence, then I think we would have a far better chance of forcing the government not to take these actions.
You're an editor of an online magazine. What do you think the media's role is in all of this?
Well, the media's role changes quite a lot. I think the media is playing a fairly problematic role now in relation to Iraq, which is that it's kind of just promoting a really unpositive form of defeatism. So the media is promoting this kind of really grisly message and this kind of pro-death, look at these dead children, this really kind of pornographic, salacious approach to conflict rather than anything analytical or objective or serious.
So you think if we had a more principled approach, the government would be more likely to listen to us? But wouldn't you say that that's fairly principled? I mean, all the images of death, that's fairly, we don't want this war happening, but they're still not listening.
It's the opposite.
How would we become more principled?
That kind of pornography stuff, war pornography, is the opposite of principled. And you'll actually read war correspondents now explicitly saying we need to publish this imagery in order to wake people up, because apparently the British public is so stupid. And they, you read articles by them where they will say British public doesn't like numbers, it doesn't like facts, it doesn't like analysis, it prefers just hard-hitting imagery, and that's why they publish these pictures. So it's actually a disavowal of principle, it's a disavowal of objectivity in favour of just publishing some cheap image of some Palestinian kid wandering around with half a leg or something. It really is that kind of level. It's a kind of a way of avoiding serious public debate and serious coverage in favour of just promoting these images. So it's the absence of principle, it's the absence of any kind of serious objective journalism in relation to all forms of Western military intervention, which now means that they just kind of rely on this imagery instead. The focus in Britain and America on how terrible it is to have all these casualties and how many people have died, and you have these kind of body count websites where it's saying 100,000 people dead, 200,000 people dead, and all this imagery of dead people has created this climate where people in Iraq, political military groups in Iraq and Afghanistan recognise that the way to hit the West hardest now is to take casualties, because the West is so casualty averse in this really profound way where every dead soldier and every dead civilian can become a political weapon, that these kind of slightly opportunistic, militaristic, sometimes Islamic groups have recognised that's a real weak point. That is why I think you have, for the first time in a number of decades, groups that seem to be entirely focused on causing many casualties as possible. Huge car bombs in Iraq, the destruction of mosques, blowing people up in marketplaces, blowing up schools, all this kind of thing. Because it's not because these people are just demented savages, it's because the new interplay between the West and the countries that it intervenes in is this kind of real casualty aversion, risk aversion. And so I think the defeatist attitude and the publication of all these bloody images and the obsession with how many people have died rather than with principle and politics and analysis actually feeds into that. So I think as peace kills, I think defeatism also kills.
I found it highly questioning and it really surprised me that human rights were seen as anti-human and as something that ought to be abolished. And I don't really understand why that is or how that can be.
I think that you're really hard to please, Brendan. You and your defeatist attitude. Now it's just you're criticising the anti-war movement for realising that this war is pointless and there's no point going on, but yet you praise the movement against Vietnam when really they changed their attitudes when they witnessed the Tet Offensive happening. So what do you want?
I think that the points that you raised are very interesting, very much food for thought, and I hope that lots of people are listening to them. However, I do think, and I do agree with you in respect to the fact that the anti-war movement does need to be more cohesive. It needs to be people coming together for exactly the same principles to make it work as a gathering of people and to make a difference. However, I think whilst there's good wars, there's bad wars. As much as all different wars have many similarities, I think there's a lot of differences between them, and I don't see in reality how an anti-war movement can be kind of not a reactionary thing. How it can be, completely and cohesively an articulated idea without it. It has to be in response to something. It has to be in response to the war to be able to be anti-war.
I don't think anything will ever convince me that war's not just madness, and separating intervention from that. And I'll always be a supporter of the anti-war movement so long as that is exactly what they are, an anti-war movement. And in contrast to what you're saying, I think that the majority of human beings coming very close for this being a mainstream view?
I think that one of the problems with this discussion and with your argument has been all the way through, there has been the assumption, a rather crude assumption, that the anti-war movement is just this one whole negative thing, because I think that it's a very diverse group of people who have many different arguments, and I think some of them are very idealistic and principled, and some of them probably are guilty of being quite negative, but I don't think that they should all be lumped together.
Firstly, on the question of human rights and why they should be abolished or why they should at least be attacked and critiqued, I think the point about human rights is that they really fundamentally redefine what a right is. Prior to the emergence of human rights in the 1940s and 1950s, a right was something that you had to win for yourself. It was an expression of your own personhood. It was an expression of your independence. Your right to free speech meant that the state couldn't prevent you from speaking. Your right to association meant you could gather in public with other people without the state stopping you. It was about expressing individual sovereignty, your own right to assert yourself and do what you please. Human rights completely redefined that, so that rights became something that the state give to us and protect on our behalf. So that's why you have this reams of human rights legislation which says everyone in your nation state must have the right to clean water and the right to this and the right to that, and you have to provide it to them. So human rights transformed us from citizens with real rights who were independent of state intrusion into our lives for the most part, into human beings who are reliant on the state to protect us and look after us and guard our interests. So it completely transformed the way in which the individual relates to the state. That's why you have the bizarre situation today where you can even have a war for human rights, because human rights have become these things that are handed to us like candy, and therefore, military can intervene in a country in order to give people human rights, which is a completely bizarre idea. Democratic rights, real rights, are things that can only be won by people themselves and asserted by people themselves, whereas human rights is something completely different. On the question of what is a principled approach, what I mean by that is that basically the anti-war movement should be driven by first principles. It should decide what it stands for, what it stands against, what it represents, and then it should put those arguments out there. It should be guided by a political outlook, by a political vision, rather than by knee-jerk responses to whatever's happening around the world or whatever Gordon Brown says and all that kind of stuff. And that's the only way in which it will have any impact on the way in which things are decided and the way in which things happen. And then the final point I want to make is that I think, even though Jessica and I have disagreed on some things, I think Jessica's right when she says that the anti-war outlook has become mainstream. And I think it's important to recognise, and I think that's a problem rather than a good thing, and I'll explain why. It's important to recognise that the anti-war outlook is no longer a minority thing or a radical thing. The anti-war outlook has become, in many ways, the governing principle of Western life over the past 10 years or so. And that's because it's based on this kind of slightly defeatist attitude, on this idea that it's not worth taking any risks, on this idea that, we should just hunker down and stick within our own borders and never do anything dangerous and never try anything out. So it's become the governing principle of Western society, and that's a problem. I'm not saying it's better to have Bush in power and the pro-war outlook in power, but the anti-war outlook, which is kind of wrapped up in all this kind of misanthropy, the desire for self-preservation, the politics of fear, because if we invade Iraq, they'll come over here and kill us. All those backward political outlooks are wrapped up in the anti-war movement, which is why it's been fairly easily co-opted by governments and officials, as well as by radicals and journalists. So it has become the mainstream outlook, and that's a problem. And I think we ought to challenge it, not by saying that we should have a pro-war outlook instead, but by saying that we need a real adult, grown-up political debate about the values of our society, rather than this kind of misanthropic, anti-human, cynical opposition to anything that looks a bit dangerous.
Well, that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank Brendan for coming in and discussing this with us. Please do leave your comments by clicking on the Add Your Comments button. If you'd like to get involved in a session of Don't Shout at the telly, please email us.